Welcome to Podcast Done For You, the show where we make it as easy as possible for you to make the right choices to advance your podcasting career. So let's get started on the show. Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Podcast Done For You. Today we're going to look at the idea of whether you should host your own podcast or whether you should have a co-host. Or is there another alternative? So we're going to examine that subject in some detail. And first of all, I just want to remind you, as always, that Podcast Done For You is also a service that we offer you where we do everything from, yes, hosting it. We will be the anchor of the program right through to publishing your podcast and helping you share it. But I'll come to the whole idea of anchoring and hosting as an alternative for you. Just know that that's not the only option that we have, but it is one of our points of difference that we can offer that. And I'm going to explain a little bit why. The idea is not meant as a sales pitch, so please don't think that that's what it is. If it's not right for you, it's not right for you. But I just want to talk to you about the idea of what I'm actually doing here right now, which is having a conversation with you. Now, that is a difficult thing for many people to do, to simply turn on the camera, or at least the microphone if you're not turning a camera on as well, and say whatever it is you want to say in a conversational style so that you're not preaching to people, but you're engaging people, you're not selling people, you're informing people, you're educating them, and you're making them endear themselves to you. That is a difficult thing to do. Now, I've seen many people do it in terms of particular products where they're assuming a level of involvement and talking to a very specific product. But again, a lot of those people tend to be more gamers or salespeople. But if you are not in that category, if you have a business and you're thinking about a podcast, the idea of what you should do to actually make it happen is an important yet difficult choice. Now, what I would say to you is that just because you can doesn't mean that you should. So let's have a look at what are some of the obstacles that get in the way for you hosting your own show. Now, first of all, it's the experience of being able to actually do that and to pull that off. Now, people like myself, I've had a journalistic training. I've worked in front of the camera or behind the microphone for my entire career. So my ability to be able to do this is obviously going to be at a different level to other people who haven't got the experience. There's also the idea that it does come naturally to some people, and that's great if it does, but that truly is not a skill that many people actually have when you pull it down to it. There are a number of things that you need to think about before you make a decision. First of all is come back to the basics. Why are you doing the podcast in the first place? So the majority of people are doing a podcast because you are building credibility for your brand, your business, yourself. And you may be all of those things all at once. And that's great. To build credibility, it's important to understand that you need to be a major person on the show. So tick that box. But hosting is a different ballgame. So let's just keep pulling it apart a little bit further. What else do you want from your podcast? You obviously want to endear yourself to your audience. Now, to endear yourself to your audience, you need to be the credible person. And can you be that person while also hosting the program? Okay, let's park that for a moment as well. The next question is, do you want to have guests on your program? That is a really important thing to understand, because the decision around having a guest on a program can change the dynamic completely of the podcast. Now, again, people like myself have a journalistic training. I spent many years doing interviews and working producing TV and radio over a long period of my career, and I've been doing it many years in both this format and others online. So my ability to conduct an interview is going to be very different to someone else who has never done it before. And even though it may look easy, you may watch people on TV, you may be watching myself in various interviews that I've done and think, I can do that. But we've all done things where we think we can do it and realize, well, it's better if we get the professional in to do that. there are a lot of advantages to that. And again, we're going to come to that in a little while. What I do want to say about the guest part, which is really important to understand, is that what role do you want to play when you have a guest on the program? If we go back to where we said at the beginning and say this podcast is about you building your credibility, then it's really important that you don't play second fiddle to the guest. That is what most people end up doing. They normally fall into one of two categories. They normally become the student because they're busy learning from the guest, or two, they become the fan. And both of those are wonderful things to do, but they're not going to do anything to build your credibility. You want to have a level playing field conversation with these people. Now, whether they're in the same sphere of influence and industry as you are, or whether they are someone who's completely left of center and bringing different sets of skills to it, you want to still be demonstrating that you are a credible source. So to be able to do that and be the interviewer at the same time, that is a very, very difficult thing to pull off. If you think about it, mostly interviewers, traditionally journalists, when you see them on television, they don't pretend to be experts in a particular field. They're inquiring, they're asking questions. That is what their focus is. Their focus is with asking the questions that the audience wants to hear about. And it is a particular skill. Now, I have given over a video on how to do an interview in a podcast, so you're welcome to watch that and try and take some tips out of that one as well. But I would say to you that it is a particular skill to be able to do it. So it is important to understand where you want to sit in relation to guests that you have on the program. And if it is very much to be the credible source, then again, we're pointing to the solution that maybe, just maybe, you being the host and the only host is not the answer to the question. So then let's come to the third scenario, which is where you have a co-host. And when I'm talking about a co-host here, I'm not talking about someone like myself who is a dedicated anchor of the program, but rather perhaps a colleague or a peer that is in the same sphere of influence, that you two decide to have the podcast together because you get on and the conversation flows easily between the two of you. Again, that is wonderful. You've got to make sure that dynamic is there. What I've seen with many people is it is particularly if let me paint the picture. There are a few different scenarios here that happen. One, it's a co-worker. So if it's a co-worker, then you've got to make sure that the relationship is going to stay the long term. And that means that if the person is a staff member and you might be the owner, are they going to stay for as long as you want them to? Because you're investing a lot in their brand as well by bringing them onto the podcast. The other thing too is just because the two of you can have a conversation together, again, doesn't necessarily mean that you're keeping the audience in mind and that it's going to be at a level that your audience can understand. You don't want to be preaching to them all the time. I'm not trying to preach to you now. I hope that's not the way it's coming across. What I'm trying to do is have a conversation with you, inform you, and get you to think about the different things that you need to consider before you decide who you're bringing on, if indeed you're bringing on someone to help you host the program. What I do know from talking to many people as well, when you think about these relationships, is that if you use a peer, and that is someone who has their own business, so you're bringing two businesses together effectively to create this podcast for the benefit of both of you, again, is that relationship equal? Because I've seen that there can be resentment that develops between one person doing more or one person talking too much and not having that ability to juggle who's saying what and who's controlling the conversation. Again, there is an art form in being able to do this and being able to manage it. So I know, for example, I have run for a few years now a regular forum where there are, on average, probably about 10 to 12 people that are in the room, that we are having a meaningful conversation split between all of us in the room over an hour. Now, if you think about that, it's not a lot of time that everybody gets to talk. So you really need to make sure that you're bringing people in and out of a conversation and making it flow in a meaningful way. That is not easy to do if you don't know how. And again, if you want to focus on being the expert, you have to consider, is this something that is worthwhile you trying to upskill yourself on? Now, I know from experience about how hard these things can be. I recall a situation, it was probably about 5 years ago now, where a particular client that I was working with wanted to save a little bit of money, asked if I would conduct the interview, film it, and also coach the people who were being interviewed because I wasn't going to appear in this particular one, and control the audio as well. So I was playing about 4 people in one. And let me tell you, it didn't really go as well as it could have done if we'd have taken 2 or 3 people to support in that situation. So I've learnt my lesson in that, and I often do bring people along when I have that kind of situation. And it's again one of the reasons why you need to think about, is it worthwhile having someone else coming in? Because whilst there are tools that can help you that are out there, and we've talked about some of them in previous episodes, and we will in future episodes as well, again, how many things do you want to be juggling and managing when your sole real goal is to be the expert, the credible person on this program? So I encourage you to think strongly about that. Now, I want to say to you this, that if you decide that it is you being the host of the program, that you can handle it, then make sure you take the time to think about the flow of the program and make sure you are very aware of how you're going to inject yourself into the conversation in a way that's not just asking a question, but is delivering some real value to your audience, because it really is an important thing for you to do if you are interviewing someone. And if you are just going to talk by yourself, then again, it's even more important that you have some kind of flow to the conversation and that it is meaningful for people to be sitting and listening to, and that they understand that you are talking not at them, but to them, as I'm trying to do with you right now. It sounds easy, but it's not. I've used this example before, but I'll use it again. Just because we all have a camera in our pockets, and a very powerful camera at that with our phones, does not make us a photographer. And if we look back on all of the photos that we've got on our phones, how many of them could you say were at professional standard? I'd say if you got one in about 10,000, you're probably doing quite well. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try. It just means that when it comes time for the professional photos, you know where you go. And it's the same thing with this. I've heard people talk about losing their puff, losing their steam in trying to keep going with the podcast because there's so many things to do. You know, there is all of this stuff in planning, preparation, making sure you're credible, not to mention all of the editing, publishing, and sharing that has to happen along the way. If you are going to be a one-man band in doing all of that, just understand that there is a lot of time and effort that's involved in all of it. Yes, it can be very rewarding to get it done, very rewarding, but it will take you quite a bit of time. And the question you have to ask yourself is there stuff that you could be doing out there at the same time that's going to represent more value, create more opportunities for you to be growing the business than you doing all of this stuff? And that includes the hosting, because if you have to think about the hosting, there is preparation time. If you are just turning up to be the credible person and answering a few questions, the preparation time is much more minimalized because what you are thinking about is stuff that you already know. The whole point of having your own podcast is that you get to decide what the topics are, so no one's asking you to come on board and start talking about something you don't know anything about. So it's only collecting all of your thoughts and being able to share them in a meaningful way, again, with the audience. If that's the only thing that you want to think about, then this is the option that we spoke about at the beginning. And it's part of the service that I offer in Podcast Done For You for this very reason. And I'll give you a bit of the backstory just so for those of you that aren't familiar with it. I started my own podcast, had wanted to have my own podcast for some time. There were various reasons why I started that podcast. Loved it. Was really doing a great job. It's still out there, BizBytes. I hope you enjoy BizBytes if you haven't caught an episode of it, do check it out. Biz Bites is a very different podcast to what this one is. It is an interview podcast, and some of those rules, I'm going to come back to them in a minute. The reason why I have that podcast is different to why you would have the podcast. But let me just say this to you, that if you are planning to do that kind of a show where you are interviewing guests, mine is not the example that you want to follow in some respects, because my goal is to demonstrate a little bit of my expertise as far as marketing is concerned, but my real goal in that podcast is to demonstrate that I can deliver value to an audience by extracting information and stories and things of value from a guest and to present it to an audience, because that's what I'm trying to demonstrate as my ability as an anchor. And that's what I wanted to talk to you about, is that whole concept of being the anchor of a program. For me, is something that comes very naturally and easily. Think of it in this context. When you go to a conference and there's a panel at the end of it where you get 3 or 4 of the speakers on there, you always have someone that is emceeing and controlling it. This is the same scenario. We want you to be part of that panel of experts. So my goal is to really make sure that that is very easy. And as I said, you just show up and do that. Now, we'll include a link into the channel that I have dedicated to some of my clients' podcasts where I'm doing exactly that for them. And again, there are lots of reasons why. In fact, I even have a podcast that I do that is kept private, and that's for various reasons. It's not a general public podcast, but it is one where I do all of the interviews, and the person that has hired me to do those is not even on the program at all. I'm just conducting interviews on his behalf. And that can also be a very valuable tool to have. I'm not suggesting that's right for you. What I'm suggesting is there are many options in front of you. Do not think because you've decided to have a podcast, and applause for that. You definitely need to have a podcast. If you're here, it's because you're in the right place. You're seriously thinking about a podcast, but the makeup of it, don't get caught in the trap that you need to be everything in that podcast. Now, if you want to be the host, think of everything that you need to achieve, work out whether you're going to get the value for money by doing that versus working with someone like myself who will help make that happen. And I'm not here to give you all of the details on what we do. We'll design it to suit you. At the end of the day, right, it does not need to be a big thing for you, a big intrusion to actually have a podcast. Some of my clients, we just spend 2 hours a quarter in recording, and that's it. And they've got their podcast. So you want more details on that, you'll have to contact me. And the details for podcast done for you will, of course, be in the show notes. But just to wrap things up, I just wanted to say to you that the whole idea of who should host your podcast, think about it very, very carefully. Think about whether there is a co-host scenario, whether it will be an equal partnership, how you will actually bounce off one another, who is actually going to control the flow of the conversation. Will you still have your audience in mind? Will you be able to bring it back to that? Will you be able to control the length and all of those things that go along with it, as well as any of the technical things? Can you do all of that yourself? That is one thing to think about. That's one thing with a co-host. Then if you think about you're going to be the solo host, you're taking on a lot of responsibility. And just understand that the responsibility that you have that is number one is to your brand and to you building credibility, creating more sales opportunities, consistently educating the market, making them understand the true value that you bring to the table by sharing all of your stories. Can you do that by being the host, by being the, and particularly hard if you're not going to have anyone on the program and it's just you talking. This is not easy. I'm doing this now. It seems easy. It's not easy. I can tell you, I've spoken to many people who have tried and failed, and to be able to deliver in a consistent fashion. So I welcome you, and if that's what you want to do. And in future episodes, we might even have a few tips on how to try and manage all of these things in one go. We've certainly got a few in previous episodes, and I hope you will subscribe to the Podcast Done For You show. The subscribe is just below you if you're watching it on YouTube. And of course, if you're listening to this on any of the other podcast platforms, please, we'd love you to subscribe there, to like and comment. But particularly, we're trying to attract more and more people on YouTube. So we'd love it even if you are on Spotify. Go check it out on YouTube for a moment. Hit subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes of the Podcast Done For You show. And as always, if you would like some support with your podcasts, if you might even like the podcast done for you by us, including, as I said at the beginning, the option for us to anchor the program. And it is an option. It isn't the only thing that we offer, but it is the option that is the most popular for all of the reasons that we've spoken about in this episode. Then come talk to us. Details below at podcastdoneforyou.com.au. And for that, I will leave you. Subscribe, and we'll see you next time on the Podcast Done For You show.